Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going deep on the changes happening in LA's housing world.
Sounds exciting.
It really is, especially with this new state law, SB 684, that's meant to really speed up the process of getting those smaller multifamily housing projects built.
Yes.
We've got some really interesting excerpts here from a memo from the LA Department of City Planning. They break down this new law, and we also have some key points pulled from LA zoning regulations.
Great.
Yeah, so we're going to untangle all of this and see just how these changes could reshape how housing gets developed here in LA.
All right.
So maybe we could just start with like the basics of SB 684. I mean, it's designed to address California's housing crisis.
It is.
But like how?
Well, it's fascinating how California and LA in particular are really grappling with this severe housing shortage.
Yeah.
SB 684 is trying to tackle this head on and make the approval process for certain housing developments so much faster and smoother.
Okay, so the memo keeps mentioning this ministerial approval process.
Right.
What does that actually mean for, like, say, a developer who wants to build a small apartment complex?
Good question. Basically, it means their project could potentially bypass a lot of the typical roadblocks that have always slowed down housing development.
Okay.
Ministerial approval means that decisions are based on, like, a clear set of standards. It removes a lot of the subjectivity and, the potential for those frustrating delays that used to be so common.
So no more of those public hearings that just drag on, or like you think you're good to go and then boom, a surprise appeal pops up at the last minute.
Exactly. It's like developers who check all the boxes, it's like they're getting a fast pass through the system.
Oh, wow.
The law actually mandates a 60-day timeline for making a decision, which is lightning fast compared to how it used to be.
Wow. Yeah, that's got to be appealing for developers for sure.
Yeah.
But this makes me wonder, who actually qualifies for this super speedy process?
Well, the memo is very specific about the eligibility requirements. So first off, there's a 10-unit cap on how big the project can be.
Okay.
And that doesn't include ADUs and JADUs, those granny flats and backyard units that have become so popular.
Oh, right, yeah.
Then the lot size can't be larger than 5 acres. That's important.
Okay.
And maybe the most crucial part is that the lot has to already be zoned for multifamily residential development.
So you can't just like sneak a bunch of extra units onto a single family lot?
Nope. No way. That's a no-go.
Interesting. I noticed in the memo that lots created under SB 9, that state law that lets you split single family lots.
Right.
Those aren't eligible for this SB 684 streamlining.
You're right.
Any idea why?
Good catch. It seems like lawmakers were trying to avoid what some people might call a streamlining double dip.
Ah, I see.
SB 9 already makes it easier to split lots, so if those new lots could then also use SB 684, it might have seemed like a loophole.
Ah, so it's about like balancing things out.
Exactly. You want to encourage development, but also maintain some control over how it happens.
Makes sense.
Oh, and I almost forgot. There's also a minimum lot size of 600 square feet for any newly created parcels.
I guess it's to prevent things from, like, getting too cramped.
Yeah, probably.
Even with these new rules, they don't want tiny lots.
Right, exactly.
Okay. This brings up something that I think a lot of people are worried about.
Okay.
Does this new law mean developers are going to come in, tear down existing housing, maybe even affordable housing, and just build these new developments?
Yeah, it's a totally valid concern, and the memo actually addresses it head on.
Okay.
SB 684 has some really important safeguards in place to protect those lower income tenants from being displaced.
Okay.
It flat out prohibits demolishing rent-controlled units.
Okay.
Or any units that have been occupied by tenants for the past 5 years.
That's good to hear. So no kicking out those long-term renters to take advantage of this new law.
Exactly. Can't do that.
That's reassuring.
And just to add an extra layer of protection for tenants, the Ellis Act protections, those still apply. That means landlords can't just evict a whole bunch of tenants just so they can use SB 684.
Right, right.
And of course, if demolition does happen, maybe for, legitimate reasons, the Housing Crisis Act replacement requirements, those would kick in.
Right.
That means a certain percentage of the new units would have to be designated as affordable.
Okay, so that helps clarify things a little bit.
Yeah.
But what about the environment? I mean, is SB 684 basically giving developers a free pass to build wherever they want?
No, not at all. The memo is very clear about this.
Okay.
There are certain environmentally sensitive areas where these projects are absolutely off limits.
Okay.
We're talking about things like prime farmland, wetlands, very high fire hazard zones, protected habitats,
Okay.
and any land that's under a conservation easement.
So you're telling me No luxury condos in the middle of a nature preserve.
Nope, not if you want to follow SB 684. And it doesn't stop there.
Oh.
There are even more restrictions and conditions that apply if you want to develop on, say, a hazardous waste site or a flood zone, an earthquake fault zone.
Okay.
So safety and protecting the environment, those are still major priorities.
Okay, so they're not just throwing those concerns out the window.
Nope.
Now, the memo spends a lot of time talking about these objective standards.
Right.
So for someone who's trying to understand how SB 684 will actually work on the ground, what does all this mean?
This is where we really get into the weeds for developers.
Right.
This is all about the specific rules that can and cannot be applied to these streamlined projects.
Got it.
And there are some really important points here. For instance, the city isn't allowed to restrict density below 30 units per acre or 1,452 square feet of lot area per unit.
Okay.
So if a developer is trying to fit as many units as possible onto a piece of land, they're going to be paying close attention to that 30 unit per acre minimum.
Got it.
That sets a baseline density that local regulations can't touch.
Oh, whoa.
Even if those regulations would normally allow for fewer units.
Interesting. Okay, so that brings us to another big issue, especially here in LA.
Oh, yeah.
Setbacks.
Ah, yes. The setback showdown.
Yeah, those rules about how close you can build to the property line can be like a huge source of tension between neighbors.
Absolutely.
What does SB 684 say about all of that?
Okay, get ready. This is where it gets really interesting. The law states side and rear setbacks can't be more than 4 feet away from the original lot line.
Oh, from the original. Not like a newly created one.
That's right. And this is potentially great news for developers.
Also.
It might give them more space to work with.
I see.
And that means they can maybe fit in more units compared to when setbacks are measured from newly created lot lines.
Oh, so we might see even more of those infill developments that are already popping up everywhere.
Exactly. Filling in those gaps.
Interesting.
And there's another important nuance here.
Oh, yeah?
Any existing structures or even new ones built in the exact same footprint.
Okay.
Those are totally exempt from these setback rules.
Oh, so like if you're keeping the same footprint, you get a pass on those setbacks.
Exactly. It's like the law is acknowledging that it's good to preserve what's already there, if possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I was reading through the memo and I noticed something.
What's that?
It doesn't say anything at all about front setbacks.
Oh, that's a big omission.
Yeah. So does that mean it's a free-for-all when it comes to how close a building can be to the street?
Well, since SB 684 is silent on front setbacks, it leaves that open for each local jurisdiction to decide.
Oh, so that could lead to some conflict between developers and the city.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to watch as this law gets put into practice.
Okay, so we've covered density, setbacks, but now for the real LA question.
Uh-oh, what's that?
Parking.
Ah, yes. The eternal struggle. Parking in LA.
Always a hot topic. So how does SB 684 try to handle this?
Well, it attempts to simplify things, which is always welcome.
Okay.
It sets a limit on parking requirements to a maximum of 1 space per unit.
So maybe we'll see fewer of those huge parking garages that seem to dominate so many new developments.
You never know. It's definitely possible.
That would be a welcome change, for sure.
And for folks who are big fans of alternative transportation, here's some even better news.
Okay.
If the project is close to a car share service, a major transit stop, or one of those high-quality transit corridors, guess what?
What?
No parking is required at all.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's like a built-in incentive to build in areas where people can already get around easily without a car.
Exactly. It's a smart way to encourage that kind of development.
Yeah, it could actually help with all that traffic congestion, at least in theory.
In theory, and hopefully in practice, too.
Okay, so this all sounds really interesting, but I'm wondering how it fits in with all those rules that LA already has for smaller developments.
Like what?
Like the small lot subdivision ordinance? I mean, they seem to cover a lot of the same ground, right?
That's where it gets tricky, and it's crucial to understand this part. SB 684 actually overrides some of what's in the small lot subdivision ordinance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it preempts those density limitations in RD and RMP zones.
Those are the multifamily zones, right?
You got it. The ones that are often targeted for those smaller developments.
Right.
So that 30 units per acre minimum from SB 684.
Yeah.
That takes precedence, even if the small lot subdivision ordinance would normally allow for fewer units.
Oh, so in those zones, SB 684 actually gives developers the potential to build more densely than they could before.
Exactly.
That's a game changer. This law could really shake things up.
It definitely has the potential to. And there's another interesting twist.
Oh, tell me.
That minimum lot width requirement in the small lot subdivision ordinance doesn't apply anymore to SB 684 projects.
Wow. So developers have more flexibility in how they design those smaller lots?
You got it.
Okay, with all this talk of streamlining, it seems like it's almost a guaranteed win for developers.
Oh, it's not quite that simple.
No.
Even with SB 684, there are still ways that a project can be turned down.
Really? Tell me more about that.
The memo mentions something called a specific adverse impact clause.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Basically, it gives the city the power to say no to a project, but only if it poses a really clear and significant threat to public health or safety.
So it's not like they could just reject it because they don't like it.
Right, it has to be something serious.
Okay, like what kind of things?
Imagine a project that would make traffic way worse in an area that's already gridlocked.
Yeah, I can see that being a problem.
Or a development that would put a sensitive environmental resource at risk.
Right.
Those are the situations where the city could step in and say, hold on, we need to take a closer look at this.
Okay, so there's still some oversight and the power for the city to make sure things are done responsibly.
Right, it's not a complete free-for-all.
But it's important to remember that simply not fitting in with the current zoning ordinance or the general plan, that's not enough to kill a project.
Exactly. The memo is very clear about that.
So if it meets all the requirements of SB 684 and it's not a danger to public health or safety, it's likely to get approved.
It seems that way. It's all about making it easier to build housing, which is what the law is intended to do.
That makes sense. Okay, now let's talk about the coastal zone, those amazing areas near the beach.
Yes. Prime real estate.
I know a lot of people are wondering if SB 684 applies there.
Good question.
I mean, those areas have their own special considerations, right?
That's absolutely right. And the memo addresses that specifically.
Okay.
SB 684 does apply in the coastal zone.
Okay.
But there's a big caveat.
Okay, I'm listening.
It doesn't override the Coastal Act, which has its own set of rules specifically designed to protect California's beautiful coastline.
So no sudden surge of beachfront condo towers ignoring those Coastal Act protections.
Not so fast. Those projects in the coastal zone, they still have to go through the whole coastal development permit process.
Right, with all those public hearings and everything.
Exactly. It's a pretty significant exception to the usual streamlined process that SB 684 offers.
So building near the coast, be prepared for a lot more scrutiny.
Definitely.
Okay, let's go back to SB 684 and the small lot subdivision ordinance for a minute.
Sure.
They both deal with smaller developments, but there are some subtle but important differences between them, right?
You're right.
What should developers be paying attention to as they try to figure out this new landscape?
Well, the memo actually does a nice job of this. It compares the two side by side.
Okay.
It highlights those specific small lot subdivision ordinance parts that SB 684 supersedes.
That's helpful.
It definitely helps to clear things up, but there are still a few potential areas that could cause confusion.
Oh, like what?
Take R2 zoned parcels. Those are the ones that usually allow for duplexes.
Right.
Under SB 684, they can now be used for small lot subdivisions.
Oh, so that's a new opportunity.
It is. But there's a catch.
Oh, what's that?
They can't use the small lot subdivision ordinance.
Oh, interesting. So it's a bit of a trade-off.
Exactly. More opportunities, but maybe less flexibility.
Got it. So developers really need to know these nuances.
Absolutely. It can make a big difference.
Now, what about ADUs?
Good one.
We talked about those earlier, those extra dwelling units.
Right.
Does SB 684 change how they can be included in these projects?
Well, while SB 684 itself doesn't directly mention ADUs, the city of LA has actually stepped in and clarified their own rules about incorporating ADUs into projects that fall under SB 684.
Oh, so they're filling in the gaps.
Exactly.
So what have they said?
They've laid out regulations for both small lot developments and common interest developments.
Okay, so different rules for different types of projects.
Right, it can get complicated.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. For those townhome style developments or small lot subdivisions, you can only have one attached ADU or JADU per parcel.
So no turning every unit into a mini ADU compound.
Right. I know that's been a concern for some communities worried about too much density.
Yeah, I can see that.
But for common interest developments,
like condos.
Exactly. There's more leeway. You can have attached or detached ADUs, JADs, even movable tiny homes.
Oh, wow.
As long as they follow the city's ADU ordinance or the state regulations for multifamily structures.
So more options for condo owners to add living space or, generate some rental income?
Exactly. It's a way to increase housing supply without always needing those big construction projects.
Now, there's one more thing from the memo I wanted to ask about.
Okay, what's that?
These early start building permits.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
It sounds like it could be a big advantage for developers.
It could.
Can you explain what it means for those of us who might see construction starting before it seems like everything's approved?
Sure. Basically, it lets developers secure building permits before the final map of the subdivision is actually recorded.
Oh, wow. So they can start building sooner.
Exactly. It can save them a lot of time and get things moving more quickly.
But isn't that kind of risky for the city? What if something goes wrong and that final map never gets recorded?
That's a good point, but the memo addresses that.
Okay.
It says they won't issue a certificate of occupancy until that final map is officially recorded.
Oh, so that protects the city in case something goes wrong.
Right. They want to make sure everything is done by the book before people move in.
Makes sense. Okay, this is all about SB 684 specifically.
Yeah.
But I think it would be helpful to connect it to the bigger picture of LA zoning.
Okay. Sounds
We
good.
have that summary of zoning regulations here. So what are some of the key things that anyone who's interested in housing development really needs to understand?
Well, understanding zoning is crucial for navigating LA's development world.
Yeah.
It's like the rule book for what you can and can't build in different parts of the city.
Right.
Two really important terms that pop up all the time are FAR,
What's FA?
floor area ratio, and RFAR, residential floor area ratio.
All right. And those basically control how big a building can be
Yeah.
on a specific lot, right?
Exactly. You got it. The zoning regulations lay out specific FAR and RFAR limits for different zones in the city.
So it's a way to manage how dense things get,
Right.
make sure new buildings are like the right size for their surrounding.
Exactly. It's all about keeping things in balance.
What about height districts? Those are in the zoning summary too.
Oh, yes. Those are important too.
I know a lot of people are worried about how new development will affect the look and feel of their neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
How do those height limits play into all of this?
Height districts set those maximum building heights for different parts of LA.
Right.
They have a huge impact on the city's skyline.
Yeah.
And they help preserve views, which is important to a lot of people.
For sure.
The zoning regulations list specific height limits for each of those residential zones, but
But
those limits then have to work in conjunction with SB 684's density requirements. It's a balancing act, trying to maximize the number of housing units while also staying within those height restrictions.
that sounds super complicated.
It can be. Zoning is complex, especially in a city as big and diverse as LA.
Okay, I have to admit, all this zoning talk is making my head spin a little.
I hear you. It can be a lot to take in.
Yeah. Can we maybe unpack some of that jargon that's so confusing, especially for those of us who aren't urban planning experts?
Of course. Where should we start?
How about those zoning designations that I see everywhere? RD, RMP, R2. What do they all mean?
Okay, good place to start. So RD stands for Restricted Density Multiple Dwelling. That covers a whole bunch of different multifamily zones.
Got it.
RMP, that's mobile home park.
Makes sense.
And then you have R2, which is for two-family dwellings, things like duplexes.
Okay, and those different zones all have their own specific rules that will affect how SB 684 is applied. Right.
Exactly. It's not one size fits all.
Okay, that makes sense. But what are those supplemental use districts that I see in the zoning summary? What are they all about?
Yes. Those add another layer of complexity, I know, but they're important. They basically bring in extra regulations on top of the base zoning for that area.
So it's like fine-tuning the rules.
Exactly. It's about tailoring the rules to the specific needs and characteristics of a particular area.
Got it. So like a historic preservation overlay zone.
Right. That might have stricter rules about what kinds of designs are allowed so they can protect the character of those historic buildings.
Oh, I see. So it's like a custom zoning suit for a specific area.
That's a great way to put it. It shows just how complex zoning can be.
Yeah, LA definitely doesn't do things halfway.
Definitely not. But even though it's complicated, it's so important to understand these zoning designations.
Yeah, I'm certain to see that.
Whether you're involved in development or you're just a resident who wants to understand how their city is changing and evolving.
This has been really helpful. I feel like I'm actually starting to get grasp on SB 684
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
and how it all interacts with LA's crazy zoning rules.
It's a lot to absorb, for sure.
It really is. But it's clear that this new law could totally reshape how housing is developed here in LA.
No doubt about it. It has the potential to be a game changer.
But we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore,
Oh, yeah, we've just laid the foundation.
Exactly.
There are so many more questions to answer, so many more angles to consider.
Well, luckily, we've got more time to dive deeper.
We do. We'll be back soon to tackle even more about SB 684 and how it's going to affect LA's housing future.
I can't wait.
Me neither. Welcome back to our deep dive on LA housing.
All right, so we've spent part one really digging into the details of SB 684.
We did.
But I want to talk about the bigger picture now. You know, what people are actually saying about this new law.
Okay, yeah, I've been hearing a lot of buzz about SB 684 too.
Yeah.
Both good and bad.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Some folks are really excited about the idea of more housing being built, while others are worried about what it might do to their neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. A lot of different perspectives.
Absolutely.
So let's try to unpack some of those hopes and concerns.
Okay.
Starting with the big one, affordability.
Right.
I mean, everyone knows LA is facing a huge challenge when it comes to finding affordable places to live.
Yeah, it's a crisis.
So will SB 684 actually help with that, or could it potentially make things even worse?
Well, those who support the law say it's really important for increasing the housing supply,
Okay.
especially for those missing middle housing types that are like almost non-existent in LA.
Missing middle. Can you remind me what that means again?
Sure. It's those multifamily developments that fall somewhere in between single-family homes and those massive apartment buildings.
Okay, so things like duplexes, triplexes.
Yeah. Fourplexes, small apartment buildings, those types of things.
Got it.
The idea is that these are often more affordable than those huge luxury developments.
Right.
And they can help create neighborhoods that are more diverse and more walkable, too.
Okay, so the thinking is if we make it easier to approve these smaller projects,
Yes.
SB 684 could help create more housing, and hopefully some of it will be more affordable.
Right. It could help bridge that gap.
But I'm sure not everyone is convinced.
Definitely not.
What are some of the concerns that people have raised?
One of the big worries is that even though the law has those safeguards against demolishing rent-controlled units, it could still lead to older housing being torn down.
Okay.
And a lot of that older housing, even if it's not officially affordable,
Right.
it's still relatively inexpensive. And a lot of Angelenos rely on it.
I see. So the worry is that those older, more affordable units could be replaced by newer, fancier ones.
Exactly. And those new ones are going to be way more expensive.
Yeah.
And then what happens to the people who can't afford those higher rents? They get pushed out.
Right, that's a serious concern.
It is. Some people argue that SB 684, while it has good intentions, it doesn't do enough to actually create housing that's truly affordable for those lower income residents.
That's a really good point. It seems like a lot depends on how this law is actually put into practice.
Definitely.
And whether there are ways to make sure affordability is really prioritized.
It's going to be important to keep an eye on that.
What about the impact on neighborhoods themselves? I mean, LA is known for its unique neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah,
Each
absolutely.
with its own vibe and history.
Yeah.
Could SB 684 lead to like a cookie cutter approach to development?
Ooh, that's another concern that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
People are worried that by streamlining the approval process and limiting the design review that can happen, SB 684 could lead to all these generic developments popping up.
So we could start seeing the same boring apartment buildings everywhere, even in neighborhoods that are known for their, like, craftsman homes or Spanish colonial architecture.
It's definitely a possibility, and if that happens, it would be a real loss for the city.
It would. LA's neighborhoods are so special. They have so much character.
I agree. They do, and that's something we need to protect.
So even with this streamlined process, we need to make sure there's still room for thoughtful design and community input.
Exactly. It's about making sure these new developments actually add to the existing character of a neighborhood.
Yeah, not take away from it.
Right. It's a delicate balance for sure.
So it seems like SB 684 could be a really useful tool for increasing the housing supply.
It could.
But it's not a magic solution.
Definitely not.
It needs to be approached really carefully with an understanding of both the positive and the negative consequences.
You got it. It's all about being strategic and thoughtful.
Okay, let's talk about community input for a sec.
Okay.
One of the things about SB 684 is that it limits the opportunity for those public hearings.
That's right.
So how can communities make sure their voices are still heard?
That's a great question, and it's something we need to think about carefully.
Yeah, because community engagement is so important for good urban planning.
Absolutely. Even with streamlined processes, there are still ways for residents to share their thoughts and concerns.
Like what?
Well, they can get involved in those early stages of a project.
Okay.
or they can reach out to their elected officials.
So basically, even though the rules have changed, it's more important than ever for people to stay informed and make their voices heard.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and being engaged is how we shape the future of our neighborhood.
I like that. Knowledge is power. Okay, we've been talking about this mainly from the perspective of residents and communities.
Right.
But I think it's important to consider how developers are viewing this new law as well.
Oh, for sure. They're the ones who are actually going to be putting it into action. Right.
Exactly. So what are they saying about SB 684?
Well, from what I've heard, a lot of developers are pretty happy about it.
Really?
Yeah, they see it as a step in the right direction.
Okay, how so?
It makes the approval process much more predictable and efficient.
Okay.
That streamlined timeline.
Yeah.
And those objective standards, those can really cut down the time and money it takes to get a project approved and built.
So less red tape, faster turnaround times.
Exactly. And that's a big deal for developers.
I bet. Time is money, right?
Exactly. And because SB 684 limits those discretionary reviews and appeals, there's less risk of running into unexpected delays.
Okay, so it gives them more certainty.
Exactly. It's less of a gamble.
Yeah, I can see how that will be appealing, especially if you're trying to work within a tight budget.
Absolutely. Every delay costs money.
But even with this streamlined process, I imagine building in LA still has its challenges, right?
Oh, for sure.
What are some of the things developers still have to deal with, even with SB 684?
Well, finding the right place to build is always a huge hurdle.
Right. I mean, land costs in LA are astronomical.
They are. And everyone's competing for those prime spots.
Exactly.
So that's a challenge right off the bat.
And even if the permitting process is faster, developers still have to follow all those building codes and environmental regulations, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's still a complicated process. It takes a lot of expertise and really careful planning.
I can imagine. And then there's the whole financial side of things.
Oh, yeah, don't forget about that.
Getting the money to actually build these projects is tough. Right?
Securing financing for housing projects is always a challenge. And the economy being what it is right now, it just adds another layer of uncertainty.
So even with streamlined approvals, you still need to convince someone to give you the money to build.
Exactly. You've got to have a solid plan, and you've got to find investors who believe in it.
And then there's construction costs.
Right. Those have been going through the roof lately.
Seems like everything is more expensive these days.
It really does. And those rising costs, those can really impact whether a project is even feasible, no matter how fast the approvals go.
So even with SB 684, developers still need to be really realistic about the bottom line.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting permits. It's about making the numbers work.
This is making me think about all the other new housing laws that California has passed recently.
Yeah, there've been a lot.
Feels like a new one every month. How does SB 684 fit in with all of those, like SB 9 and the ADU laws? Are they all working together?
That's a great question. It can be hard to keep track of all these changes.
It really can.
But SB 684 is actually designed to work with those other state laws.
Okay, so they're not competing with each other.
Right. It's all part of a larger strategy.
Yeah, like a multi-pronged approach to increasing housing options.
Exactly. Each law focuses on a different piece of the puzzle.
I see.
But here's where it can get tricky.
What do you mean?
With so many new laws and regulations coming out, it's more important than ever to really understand what applies where.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
It is. That's why it's so important to stay informed.
Okay, so any advice for those of us who are trying to make sense of this new landscape?
Definitely. Stay curious. Keep learning about the latest laws and regulations.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right.
And if you're really serious about this stuff, talk to the experts.
Brickwork is a land use and development expert specializing in residential communities that transform raw land into thriving neighborhoods. The company manages the entire development cycle, from site acquisition and planning through construction and completion, delivering both single-family homes and multi-unit complexes. With expertise in architectural design, construction management, and infrastructure integration, Brickwork creates sustainable developments that blend seamlessly with existing communities while meeting all local planning requirements and building standards.